Welcome to the Noble Ape podcast, Ape Reality. I'm Tom Barbalet, and this serves as the May 2008 Mailout. Well, I'd like to start this podcast by sending a shout out to Gerald de Jong, who resumed his DarwinAtHome podcast recently. In fact, I was so taken by it, I recorded a little video footage on my walk home yesterday in homage to Gerald's most recent podcast, which he recorded whilst walking. Somewhat interestingly, I found the podcast had, residual memories in my own mind of doing Huffman coding, and I put this to Gerald, and Gerald confirmed that he had some background in Huffman coding as well, so I'm not sure whether it was subliminally related scarring or something like that, but the stuff he talks about with regards to nuances in DarwinAtHome is very similar to my recollection of Huffman coding. Well, this podcast gets way more listeners than Biota Live currently, and I think it's rather strange, so I'd like to send a shout out to Biota Live, my weekly podcast that typically takes roughly an hour. You can get more information at biota.org/podcast. If you like the podcasts associated with Ape Reality, you'll probably really like the Biota podcasts, so check them out too. That URL again, biota.org/podcast. A large portion of my month has been spent writing my chapter for Nature-Inspired Informatics, and it's really turning into an archaeology of my development to date. It's actually quite fascinating writing such an applied but also a reflective chapter. However, obviously this is going out to students, so there needs to be more applied than there is reflective in the final draft. I'm going to be taking it with me when I go to a friend's wedding in early June. My plan is to take a printout of my chapter in Nature-Inspired Informatics as it comes together for the wedding and go through it with a red pen. Not at the wedding, but there'll be a bit of free time on my hands on the flight at least. So that's the current status with regards to Nature-Inspired Informatics, and by the time I speak to you next month for the next mail out, it will be completed, hopefully. They have extended the deadline to mid-July, but as far as I'm concerned, I want to get it to them by the original deadline of late June, just so I have it done. So I've been doing a bit of Noble Ape development while I'm not writing Nature-Inspired Informatics. In fact, the Noble Ape development has been my reward through writing the Nature-Inspired Informatics chapter. Obviously, I've talked in previous podcasts with regards to moving the development to Cocoa, and the method that I'm using currently, I have a 10.5 version of the simulation which works. The interface is pretty cobbled, but unfortunately that's the nature of the 64-bit-esque carbon interface as Apple is presenting it currently, so the only real option is to move the Mac interface through to Cocoa. Well, the step that I'm taking currently in that direction is moving the interface, the Windows menus and related stuff, over through Interface Builder, which in some regards is a harking back to ResEdit, to the circa Mac OS 5, Mac OS 6 vintage. And it's interesting in that regard because it's a bit of a digression, but at the same time, I can see it's going to be the only way forward. So really, I have no options, so that's what I'm doing currently. And my hope is that once I have the aspects associated with the Windows, because obviously the Windows are the primary drivers with regards to the Noble Ape simulation, obviously you've got the simulation or what have you going on behind the scenes, but in terms of actual operating system interaction, the Windows provide the window, funnily enough, into the simulation. So my hope is that I can get the existing 10.5 carbon windowing code, and it should be relatively easy to port over to Cocoa. This in large part is thanks to George Warner at Apple, who I remember thanking in a prior podcast with regards to the specific development, but he's the fellow who I visited in 1998, so he's one of the longest serving folks at Apple that I've continued communicating with, and he's a proud owner of a Noble Ape t-shirt. So George's assistance with regards to getting that final step, probably about a year ago now, maybe even more than a year ago, was really critical, and the next stage is obviously to move all that code over into Cocoa and then start returning aspects of the interface, things like saving files, these kind of things. And of course with the Cocoa interface comes the ability to port the Noble Ape simulation over to the iPhone. And I haven't really had a lot of opportunity to play with the iPhone developer kit yet. I'm saving that until I have a decent Cocoa interface, and obviously in the near future there's probably some benefit in holding off for a couple of weeks at least until one can see the new development source code that Apple is going to be presenting at WWDC. But running the Noble Ape simulation on the iPhone or the iPod Touch seems to be a no-brainer in terms of the interface, and I think it'll change aspects of the simulation interface that I haven't yet considered. I was thinking in large part with regards to the spatial components of the iPhone and iPod Touch with regards to tilting and things like that. That could provide almost a window into the Noble Ape simulation. Of course, obviously, some aspects of the graphics are going to have to change, but that has been the narrative to date for folks who have listened to previous mailouts in this series. The final bit of news is through the inspiration that I derived for needing something else to do other than writing the chapter for Nature-Inspired Informatics. I did a release of the Noble Ape simulation just a few days ago, actually. Noble Ape 0.688 was released, and the main change in that, aside from all the stuff I discussed with regards to male apes having babies and other related bugs that have been fixed 6 weeks ago time frame, the XML phenotype was the main feature in this release of the Noble Ape Simulation. Obviously that moves into the Evo Grid development, and for people who are familiar with the Biota podcast, the Evo Grid will be a recurring theme. We're going to be talking about it tomorrow night, in fact. But I seem to recall that the original idea for the XML interface related to graphical rendering as well. My hope is that the XML phenotype will produce something that can be run from a command line and then rendered through a graphics renderer at real-time speeds. And I think that's pretty well doable. It's just a matter of finding the right graphics renderer and ideally having some assistance from folks who understand the graphics renderer more acutely about how these things are going to be done. But it's all part of tinkering the simulation for potential third-party users, and I'm certainly going to talk more about the Noble Ape development tomorrow evening on Biota Live in this regard. I think it's interesting currently that no other simulator has stepped up and started developing XML phenotype-like structure for their particular simulations, and as I passed back to the Evo Grid development group, my feeling is that it'll take another simulator, obviously, in order to make this Evo Grid thing move forward. Ideally, maybe even a couple of simulators. So that will be coming in the future. More narrative with regards to that, obviously, in the next podcast, be it a Mailout or a specific podcast on that topic. So many listeners to this podcast, it's really quite staggering that I'm now reaching literally hundreds of people with each of these podcast releases in the Noble Ape feed. It's been more than 2 years of recording these podcasts, and it's good to have some degree of back catalogue. My hope is, once I finish with nature-inspired informatics, that I will have more time to record more podcasts. However, this has been a relatively lame narrative up until now, so I'm not going to make any particular promises, bar to say when I don't have a chapter hanging over my head, it will probably be a lot easier to pull out the recorder and just start musing on a wide variety of Noble Ape-related topics. So thank you very much for tuning into this podcast. Look forward to tuning into the next podcast.